Welcome to the Spark Live webinar series, one component of our Spark Knowledge Mobilization Program. Spark is Children's Healthcare Canada's shared platform for advocacy, research, and knowledge. Spark Live is where we gather each week to curate, convene, and showcase excellence and innovation from across the child and youth healthcare community. Our goal is to spark conversation, ideas, and action. Children's Healthcare Canada would like to thank our funding partners for their ongoing contributions that support all of our programs and activities, including this Spark Live bi-weekly webinar series. There are two options to join in on the live conversation. Questions and comments for our panel or presenters can be typed into the question box, or comments that you want to share with the audience can be typed into the chat box visible to all of our attendees. For those of you on Twitter, tag @ChildHealthCan on any webinar-related tweets or use the hashtag SparkLive. And to keep up to date on all of Children's Healthcare Canada's webinars and other activities, be sure to sign up for our weekly Spark News e-bulletin by visiting our website at childhealthcan.ca. Hello everyone, and welcome to another edition of Children's Healthcare Canada's Spark Live webinar series. The Spark theme for March is Child Health in the Media, and I'm Paula Robeson, your host for the next hour. Children's Healthcare Canada acknowledges that our offices, located in Ottawa, are on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. We recognize and deeply appreciate their historic connection to this place. And we also recognize the contributions that Métis, Inuit, and other Indigenous peoples have made in shaping and strengthening this community, our province, and the country. Today, we're delighted to speak with Dr. David Alexander to bring you Keeping Kids on the Radar, key messages on child health prioritization. But before we begin, we invite you to answer a few quick poll questions for us. Please note that you'll have to answer all three questions to submit your response. And while Jose is launching those questions, I want to thank you so much for participating, and I'd like to introduce our speaker today. Dr. David Alexander's career as a pediatrician and advocate for children spans more than 4 decades. He is currently president of Leading for Kids, which was established in 2018 with initial funding from the Lucille Packard Foundation for Children's Health, with the mission to create a society that puts children first. From 2007 to 2018, David served as president and CEO of Lucille Packard Foundation for Children's Health, where his many accomplishments included leading the foundation's fundraising efforts, resulting in more than 800 million raised during his tenure. David also worked to actively engage clinical staff and board members in philanthropy and personally led solicitation efforts resulting in several transformational gifts. Prior to this, David spent 15 years as the Children's Hospital CEO and 10 years as an academic pediatrician. He served on numerous boards, including the National Association of Children's Hospitals Board of Directors and Stanford Child Health Research Institute Board of Directors. And it is now my pleasure to pass the mic to David.
Great, thank you very much. Jose, I'm hoping everybody can hear and see me now. Good morning, everybody. And I want to thank Children's Healthcare Canada for the opportunity to talk to you guys today. It's really a wonderful opportunity for me to present this material for the first time to an international audience. So it's really wonderful to be here. You've heard a little bit about my personal story. I'm a pediatrician. I've been in this space I finished my pediatric training more than 40 years ago. It's really challenging for me to even say that. And I've been in this work in a lot of different ways. I started out as an academic pediatrician, spent about 15 years as a children's hospital CEO, and then worked on the development side of child health. And it's been remarkable to watch the transformation in child health with a small h or a capital H, I'm not sure, but if you look at what we define narrowly as child health, the most common conditions that brought children into the hospital when I started my residency, we barely see in the hospital today. The second most common admission diagnosis when I trained was meningitis from Haemophilus influenza, and most residents today have never seen that. So we've made huge strides. You know, when I trained, it was very unusual to see an adolescent with cystic fibrosis, and today there are more adults than children with cystic fibrosis. So we've made huge, huge strides. On the other hand, if you just look at the way kids are doing, it doesn't look so rosy. And for the past 30 years, I've been asking myself the question, why? What is it about us that somehow keeps us from allowing kids to do as well as we know that they can? Um, you know, this question, and it's not that we don't have the resources to solve the problems that plague childhood, because we have the resources to do whatever is a priority to us. And it's not that we don't have great solutions, because we know how to fix many of these problems, and there's no shortage of great organizations that have great solutions to many of the problems that hold kids back today. But we don't seem to be able to get our act together to do it at scale. I've been thinking about this problem for many years. And about 5 years ago, I went to the board of the foundation I was leading and said, I'm, you know, getting close to retirement, but I'm not ready to retire. And I wanted to start a new organization to try to look at and get some answers to that question about what is it about us that keeps us from advancing the well-being of kids in the way that we all would want and know that we can do. So that's how I started Leading for Kids. And if that was an easy task, somebody would have done it long before me. And you know, it was a little bit of hubris on my part to even think that this was something I could get at, but I was going to give it a go. And you know, within a week, I realized I had no idea what I was doing. Just had a lot of questions and no answers. I was very fortunate in that I had the resources at the time to do something that turned out, you know, maybe it was just that I wanted to do some international travel. But I decided that I wanted to go spend some time in places where kids are doing better than they are in the US. And I'll make the first of my apologies about this talk right now, which is that when I talk about this work, I am going to be talking about the US. I'm going to leave it to you to decide how much of what I'm saying is applicable to you in Canada. I know a bit about Canada and child health in Canada and have a lot of friends up there. But you may hear some things that I say about child health in the US and children in the US that are a little different for you guys. So, and maybe somebody will get inspired to look at some of the same questions that I'm looking at in Canada. But anyway, I was fortunate to be able to go spend several months traveling, and I went to, during that time, I visited 17 or 18 different countries and talked to all sorts of people in government, in the NGO nonprofit sector, in the child advocacy world, about how they were taking care of their kids. And I went to all sorts of countries. They were mostly but not all in Europe. Some were more wealthy countries, some were poorer countries, some were more progressive countries, some were more conservative countries. But what they all had in common was that if you look at the kind of international scorecard metrics that we've all looked at for how kids are doing, every one of these countries was doing better than we are in the United States. And those countries are pretty easy to find because the United States does terribly on every one of those international scorecards. We're always in the bottom quartile, very often at the bottom of the bottom quartile. And I know that my friends at Children First Canada have been trying to get the word about how Canada has been doing in those international metrics as well. And I know that Canada is not doing as well as many people would think they are and would like them to be. You know, I did this several months of travel, and I came back still with more questions, but you know, there were a couple of ahas for me in that travel. Number one, I was just sort of stunned at how hardwired government was in the lives of children in a way that seemed very foreign to me here in the US. You know, there wasn't a country that I went to that did it the same as any other country. But every country that I went to where kids are doing better than they were here had a children's commissioner or a children's ombudsman or a children's minister. And those were at the federal level, they were at the state level, they were at the local level. And there were, the long story short, there were people at all levels of government who went to work every day thinking about how kids were doing. And that is not something that is done here in the United States, at least very commonly. So that was a big aha. I was also quite struck by the involvement of young people themselves in the systems that serve them in ways that seemed exciting and different to me. And the thing that struck me the most is the way advocates and people in government talked about why they did their work and why kids, there's a set of things that we all know that kids need to have to do well in life. You need to have a stable and loving family and a good home and not be hungry and have shelter and good education and healthcare and all of those mom and apple pie things that we all know about. When we as American advocates for kids talk about why kids should have those things, and I think this is fairly true for you guys. The way we talk about that is several ways. We either say we should do it because it's the right thing to do, that kids deserve our best effort. That's kind of a moral way of talking about it. We sometimes say we need to look out for kids to protect them. That's a sort of protecting way of talking about kids. Or we sort of put an economic value on children and say we need to do this to invest in the future. That's kind of a future investment way of talking about kids. And the Europeans and the Australians and the New Zealanders and other people I talk to all believe in all of that stuff. They all believe that it's the right thing to do and we should invest in kids because we need to protect them and all of that. But when they talk to each other and to government about why kids should get the things that we all know they need to get, they talk about it very differently, and kids should get those things in those countries because they have a right to them. So this concept of child rights was very new to me. It shouldn't have been. It's been around the world for many, many years. But as an American person who's been deeply embedded in child health, this was very new to me, talking about child rights. And I came back from this trip thinking, well, we need to do child rights in America. Not realizing that the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child was largely written by Americans. If we were going to do that, we would have done it 30 years ago when mostly Americans wrote the UN Convention. Came back very excited about child rights, but realizing that that was going to be a very tough road. Given the fact that I'm a proud resident of the only UN member state that has not ratified that convention. So I was at a meeting in the fall of 2018, and I met my colleague, Nat Kendall Taylor, who's the CEO at the Frameworks Institute in Washington, DC. And the Frameworks Institute is a nonprofit think tank that's been around for 25 years or so, that uses the tools of social science, which are all new to me, to get a deep understanding of the way culture thinks about certain issues, and to try to move those issues in ways that are more beneficial to the organizations that are working to change the culture for the better. So they've done a lot of work in various aspects of child health and well-being, and much of the increased interest in early childhood that you've seen throughout the field over the last 20 years comes from work that the Frameworks Institute has done, largely in partnership with the Child Development Center at Harvard University. And they have largely changed the way, at least in our country, and I think mostly also around the world, people think about early childhood and the importance of early childhood. It's hard to believe that the prevailing way that people thought about early childhood 30 years ago was kind of whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And the notion of child trauma and childhood stressors was not something that people thought about at all. And research that the Child Study Center and Frameworks did really change the way we thought about this. So Nat and I hatched this crazy idea to take what Frameworks does, which I will explain to you in a second, and apply it to childhood writ large, to see if we could change basically our social contract around children. And what frameworks does, and they've done this, for, as I said, for early childhood, they've done it for environmental work, they've done it for criminal justice reform in the United States. They're doing some work that's coming out this week on how we talk about immunizations. But they do this deep dive into developing an understanding about the way a culture thinks about an issue. What are the deeply held beliefs that a culture has about an issue? And those are what we call, I'm going to take a second away from this to talk about and those are defined as cultural mindsets. These deeply held beliefs are called mindsets, and a mindset is something that not necessarily everybody in a culture believes, but is pretty widely believed across a culture, regardless of politics, regardless of geography, regardless of social status. I'm going to tell you an example of a deeply held cultural belief in the US, which is frequently referred to as the American dream, this notion that anything is possible for anybody. If you try hard enough, that anything is possible. So that American dream, this limitless, that we live in a land of limitless possibility, where with enough hard work, you can do anything. That is a deeply held cultural mindset in America that is believed by liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, people in rural America, people in urban America. That's a deeply held belief. And these cultural mindsets are really important to understand if you're thinking about an issue. Because the other thing that Frameworks has learned over their 25 years is that when advocates talk about an issue, they frequently talk about that issue in ways that sound right to them as advocates and resonate with them and their community, but don't necessarily take into account the cultural mindsets of the people whose minds they're trying to change with their advocacy. And very often that there's a disconnect between the advocacy messaging that the advocates are putting out there and the deeply held cultural mindsets that are out there in the community. And then we have, the result of that is advocacy messaging that's not as effective as anybody thinks it should be, and a bunch of frustrated advocates that say, well, we keep explaining this stuff and nobody seems to be doing anything about it. What Frameworks typically does with their process is they use the tools of social science to get a deep understanding of these cultural mindsets, and the tools that they use, without me getting into a lot of research methodology that I'm far from expert in, is they do a lot of one-on-one interviewing. They do peer group sessions, which they would call peer discourse sessions, which look like focus groups. And they do a lot of survey work to try to get at what these deep cultural mindsets are. They then look at the way the field is talking to our culture, looking at both written, online, and other communications from advocacy organizations to try to identify where there might be a disconnect between the advocacy messaging from the field and the cultural mindsets that are out there in the community. And then they look at what the media is saying about the issue to see those same sorts of things, because there's frequently a disconnect between the way the media looks at issues and the way the culture is thinking about them. So I'm going to tell you about our work with Frameworks. So after they do all of that, the next phase is to try to, with that deeper understanding, come up with ways of talking about the issue that actually have the potential to change mindsets in a way that moves the culture in a more positive direction. So before I get into our work in particular about this, let me apologize again for the second and hopefully last time and tell you that this is a work in progress. We are not entirely done with this research project, and I'm hopeful that maybe this will whet your appetite, and in about 4 months, when the last piece of this is done, you'd be interested in having me back and talk to you about kind of what the punchline is. Because right now we have maybe even raised more questions than we have answers for. So let's talk about cultural mindsets right now. So the Frameworks team used their social science magic, and there are 3 papers that have come out from this work, which I hope the folks from Children's Healthcare will make available to you after the webinar. The first one of which is about these cultural mindsets, and there were a number of them that were identified, but I want to talk to you about three of them that are probably the most influential in the way we think about kids as a people, not necessarily the way you think about them, but the way I think about them, but the way Americans writ large think about kids, and kind of may provide the key for why our traditional advocacy may be having a hard time moving the needle. So the first one of these is that Americans think very narrowly about kids' issues. So when you talk to the average American about what's a kid's issue, they tend to think about school and maybe a little bit about childcare and even less about healthcare. Healthcare comes up, but not very often. But they don't think about hunger. They don't think about housing. They don't think about transportation. Um, they don't think about the environment as children's issues. So people define kids' issues very narrowly. And interestingly, the issues that are defined as kids' issues are all issues related to care for children. You know, we look at children as individuals that require our care. And without editorializing, these care issues are ones that are largely relegated to women and largely get short shrift in our culture. So that's sort of mindset number one, the sort of narrow view that we have of the issues that impact children. The second one, and this is a kind of a huge one, is a lack of support or understanding of the needs for systems outside of the family to support kids and their families. So, and that's especially true for government. As I mentioned, when I was traveling around, you know, if you go outside of the US, you see all sorts of government support for kids and families. And Americans do not see, in general, a role for government in the lives of families, except when families are failing. So we have a very much, you know, our role is our basic view on government is that government should stay out of the lives of families and children unless families are in trouble. And we have what we call in America safety net programs. I don't know if that's a term that's used in Canada, but our safety net programs are really there for families that are in trouble. And as I've said many times, you know, safety nets aren't in the circus for the days that the trapeze artist is having a good day. They're there for when people are having a bad day. So we see a very limited role for government in the lives of families. And then the third one has to do with kind of this American dream that I talked to you about. And there's a dark corollary to the American dream, which is that, you know, if anything's possible for anybody, if you're having trouble, it must be because you've done something or not done something that makes you less deserving. And so there is a, you know, it's not talked about publicly, but there is a feeling among a lot of folks that if you are in trouble, it's because you're not doing something right or you're not trying hard enough. And if you think about, you know, our government programs are largely targeted to people who are having problems. And so not surprisingly, there is in general, not a whole lot of broad public support for those sorts of programs. So, you know, I'll pause for a second and let that sink in for a little bit. That all sounds, you know, because I've been thinking about this for a couple of years, like it's part of what I think about all the time, but it is not typically what advocates think about when they think about kids. You know, these three things about the sort of narrowness of the way people think about kids, the lack of interest of the general public in having government in kids' lives, and this notion of deservingness. Those are these deeply held beliefs that are the undercurrent and the background against which we as advocates do our work. With that in mind, we then went and looked at the advocacy messaging of about 50 US-based advocacy organizations and looked at how they're talking about their work. And once again, I'm going to just talk. There's another paper on this, which hopefully will be made available to you. Um, and there are a number of findings, but I'm going to focus on two of them. Um, I did a very cursory look at a couple of Canadian advocacy organizations that I know and respect. Children First Canada being the prime example of one. I think they're a fantastic organization, one that sort of inspired me to start what I'm doing, because they've been out there doing this kind of work in Canada for a while at their material. And I can tell you that what we found with US-based advocacy materials apply to them as well. So number one, we as advocates, and this has been true in the work that Leading for Kids did for us and in the work that they have done for virtually every other organization in every other field of social endeavor that they've looked at. We as advocates tend to use terminology that the public does not understand as well as we think that they do. Um, and uh, and without defining it nearly as well as we probably should. And a really good example of one that's used all the time now that we need to be talking about, but we need to define, is equity. And you'll see the term equity in all sorts of advocacy literature today and all sorts of advocacy materials. And the public does not understand that term. We have data to show that when you talk to the public about equity and use that term, most people think you're talking about some sort of a financial instrument, not about equity in the way we talk about it. So um, whether it's equity or any other kind of technical term, you need to look at your materials and be really careful about making sure that you define anything that's not a really common term. The second thing, another great example of a term that came up in our research that we use all the time is well-being, child well-being. There is not a well understood standard definition of that in the public. And we use it all the time. And then the other big thing that came out of our work is there's a set of terms that we as advocates use all the time to define certain populations of kids as vulnerable or at risk or needy or all of those things. And we understand what those terms mean. But if you think about these deeply held cultural mindsets that I talked about before, when somebody is vulnerable or at risk, that unintentionally triggers in much of the general public this question of deservingness. And it's interesting because we have very broad public support for children's hospitals. And our research would suggest that when we talk about children who end up in the hospital, people in general don't think that their families did anything wrong to put them in the hospital. Parents don't do anything wrong to have their kid end up with fibrosis or leukemia or diabetes. Whereas if kids are poor or in some other social struggle, there is this subconscious, unconscious thought about deservingness. So we are strongly advocating that you retire the phrases at risk or vulnerable from everything you're talking about and start to think about other ways of talking about these populations, because in a way, we are what the social scientists would say otherizing. We're making these populations into an other population other than the one that your audience, your intended audience, is sitting in. And this is going to be a big change for us because we use these terms all the time. I mean, one of the things in the US that this is done is our government involvement, as I said, is really targeted towards these populations. And the only place our government spends any money on children is in children who are, in these marginalized at-risk populations. And these programs to serve these at-risk kids have a very slim base of public support. As you may or may not know, during the pandemic, the US government finally created some sort of what we call a child tax credit, but in what in many other countries would be called a children's allowance, where 90% of American families were getting a cash benefit from the government if they have children. And interestingly, 90% of American families were getting this benefit, but the way it was talked about by the advocacy community and by the government was that it was the largest investment to reduce child poverty in the history of America, which it was. And it reduced child poverty by more than half, an amazing thing. The problem is that that messaging around child poverty did not change the hearts and minds of the American public because, much as I hate to say this, Americans writ large, when they look at poor people, once again, think about deserving this, think people are poor partially anyway, because they're not trying hard enough. And when it came time to renew the child tax credit, and there didn't seem to be a whole lot of support in our Congress to do that, there was almost no public outcry outside of the children's advocacy community to keep it going, and it went away. And so our poverty rate is back up to exactly where it was before this happened. So by focusing on poverty and by focusing on these special populations, we may have actually cut back on the effectiveness of this program. And I don't have time to talk about this today, but we have what are called our programs for kids in America are almost exclusively targeted programs that are targeted to specific populations, usually defined by either a health condition or a social need, as compared to our programs for seniors, which are universal. And the programs for seniors are much more broadly supported than the ones for kids. And we are strongly advocating that we look at a much more universal approach to many of the benefits that we know all kids need. So in America, you only get lunch in school if you're very poor, as compared to most countries in the world where if you go to school, you get lunch because that's part of going to school. And then lastly, the media. And I know you've had some other speakers talk to you about the media, but I will tell you that there's 4 quick findings in our review of both the media and a little bit about pop culture in America. Number one, much of the media coverage of kids issues is holding government accountable for its failures to help kids. And if you think about the cultural mindsets that drive Americans, most of that stuff just goes right over people's heads because subconsciously people say the government's failing, but it's not their job. The media uses a broken system narrative, which just sort of feeds into this notion that government is not really much of a help to people, and that government should be sitting in the background. The media loves to use this vulnerability phrase, talk about these poor at-risk kids and how badly they're doing. And the other thing is that the media loves to talk about this negative comparison between the US and the rest of the world, which I know has been done some in Canada for good reason, because at least for the US, we compare terribly to much of the rest of the world. But Americans don't, A, care, and B, don't believe this at all. There is another core belief that Americans have, it's called American exceptionalism, this belief that America is the greatest country in the world and nobody can do anything better. When I first started doing this work and I started comparing us to the other UNICEF countries and showing the data, people would turn off immediately. There was clearly something wrong with my data, or there's all these reasons why our country is different than these other countries. And the media loves to talk about that stuff, as do many advocacy groups, including me up until a year or so ago. That's the media. So I've got about 2 minutes left before we get to a discussion, but I want to talk to you about the work that's going on right now, which we are about 4 months from finishing. We had hoped to be done with this by now, but this thing called the pandemic got in the way because social science research used to have to be done in person, and this whole research project had to be sort of refigured out to do in a virtual environment. So we're a little bit behind. But the last thing the frameworks does is once we understand these deep cultural mindsets and the way people think, how can we as advocates talk and message our work in ways that do better? If you had asked me a year ago, I would have said, we're going to try to come up with messaging for advocates to use that change these cultural mindsets. And we do need to do that. But changing cultural mindsets is decades long. Changing these deeply held cultural beliefs is going to be the work of me for a while and the people that succeed me for a while. And if you think about deeply held cultural mindsets that have changed, I've talked to my kids about the fact that when I was in college 50 years ago, I didn't know anybody who was gay. I did, but I didn't know anybody who was out. And today, young people think about sexual orientation the way they do about handedness. And that change in mindset did not happen accidentally. That happened because of the work of lots of advocacy organizations over a long, long period of time. So we need to do that work to change these cultural mindsets that are not helpful. But in the meantime, how do we, with an understanding of the way we're thinking today, message the public in ways that don't send them running for the hills? How do we get them to understand that getting government involved with the lives of children can be helpful? So we are looking right now, and we are currently in the field testing two sets of messages. One looking at this sort of long-term cultural change, and one looking at things today. And the outcomes, the dependent variables that we're looking at there are two of them. One is sort of our collective responsibility towards children. Americans, I've never met anybody who wouldn't do anything they could for their own children, but we do not have a sense of collective responsibility for other children, other people's children. So the sense of collective responsibility, and also our sense of collective efficacy, the fact that we can, as a country, sort of do things together to make things better for kids. So that's the first outcome we're trying to test these messages against. When we frame our advocacy work in such a way, does it improve our sense of collective responsibility and efficacy? And then the other thing is this horrible term called salience, which I understand now, but most people don't. And salience is different than importance. So I have a good friend who runs an organization, a US-based organization called First Focus, and they hired a very fancy pollster and had them survey Americans on 50 different kids issues, and not surprisingly, 85% of Americans supported all of these issues. So if you ask people if kids issues are important, they all say that they are. We asked the question a little bit differently, and we said, how important is a candidate's position on this issue to your deciding whether you'd vote for them? And we asked that question, or their voting record on this issue. How important is that on whether or not you'd vote for them? And we asked that question on a 1 to 5 scale on about 40 different issues, and not a single issue got a score higher than a 3. So that's salience. That's a difference between importance, everybody says they're important, or salience, which is something that's important enough that it'll make somebody do something. So we're testing our messaging to see whether or not it will move the salience of these issues. So I'm a couple of minutes over what I said I was going to do, so I'm going to stop here and see if you guys have some questions. If you don't, I can yak on about this stuff for days, but let's see what questions you guys have.
Hi, David. It's thank you so much for your presentation. While folks are getting their questions in the question box, Jose is going to launch another poll. You'll have to answer 5 questions in order to do that, but we'll continue with the questions and answers while you are responding. There is a comment from Nora, and I'm about to open the mic so Laura can speak directly to you. Go ahead, Nora. Oh, I don't hear you. Oh, there you go.
I'm sorry, I have all these restrictions on my computer my institution put on, and I can't figure out how to get them off. So
not to worry.
I apologize for that. I don't know if I saw it. I got a laugh, so I guess I'm being heard. Am I being seen?
You're being heard, but not seen.
Okay, I apologize very much.
Not to worry.
Some of the Canadians on the call know me, David. I have kind of short curly hair, and I don't know what else to tell you. I work at I'm smiling at you. I'm applauding your messaging, and I'm very happy, and I think all of us feel like we're finally in good company when we hear the things that you're saying. My background is in occupational therapy, and I'm a researcher and an educator of occupational therapy students, but also health research methodology, and I evaluate health systems for children. So one of the things that I put in the box was that I really do identify with your messaging about the cultural mindsets, but I feel in Canada what has been more challenging for us relates to your comment about salience. It has to do with how people vote on or pay attention to or hold the government accountable for child policy. And in the Canadian case, I would say not the ever-present lack of child policy, but a decline in child policy. So if they want to cut the position of a child protection officer or a child officer at the federal level or the provincial level, it tends to happen pretty quietly. Or if they want to stop collecting data on a group of children in the census or something that's like a census, it tends to happen very quietly without a lot of accountability. And this affects resource planning. It affects a whole slew of services because we tend to have more universal services for either healthcare delivery or public health. And so quietly, piece by piece, it has become easier to take parts of the system away that were designed to hold up children from a public social perspective. And kids don't vote. And their parents I don't think they're the strongest voting demographic. And they don't buy things directly. So both in the marketplace in a North American kind of capitalist society and in the voting arena, in the civil society, kids don't have a lot of power. And I know I'm speaking to the choir here, but I think in Canada, it's more been about that quiet piece of like, oh, well, we could save a budget line here and no one's going to really notice. And the effects are so far downstream, no individual political entity at one given time is going to experience a lot of blowback because of that. And so one of the things that I wonder about as someone who's written a lot for child rights or the things that I was concerned about with regards to children and as a consequence, women and marginalized people during the pandemic, there was a lot of resistance in the media for the things that I wrote. And I thought, oh my gosh, these are not extreme statements, people. Like these are very scholarly arguments. And so I guess I really want to know how to ask about how do we keep connected to what you learn about this salience message? How do we keep connected to how your learnings about what moves people? Because
Yeah,
I really don't know.
yeah. So salience is, I've come to believe is kind of where it's at. I mean, that question, it's, if I look at the situation you described, it's like, why is it possible for that to happen?
Yeah.
How is it possible? And I suspect the same dynamic that we found with Bruce Leslie's research is going on there, that these issues are important to Canadians, but not salient. So the message, we are actively looking at what framing actually makes this messaging more salient to people. And for years, there's this Nobel laureate at the University of Chicago who was convinced that if we just talk about the economic value of children, that will, in a capitalist society, that will get people moved, and it doesn't. So, when the last paper from this tranche of research comes out, we will have some data about messaging that moves salient. It's not quite ready yet. So the way to keep up with us is just, follow us on, go to our website, sign up for our newsletter, look at us on Twitter. And sometime probably in the early fall, this next tranche of research is going to come out. And then, if we can, I mean, quite frankly, our efforts from here on out will be to take the findings of this research and actually start to get it out into the field. And we're looking now for funding to actually develop a cadre of advocates. And, I would be actually kind of interested to see if there'd be Canadians interested in getting involved in this next phase of work in getting this stuff actually used, getting our work actually used, which is going to be more of a challenge for us as advocates, because it's going to require us to think about the way we talk about things in ways that are different than the way we talk right now.
Yes. Yeah.
For me, not to talk about vulnerable populations or kids that are at risk, the drive in the US to target these programs to the most at-risk kids has largely been from people on the progressive side of things, not from the conservatives who just as soon not put any money towards anything. But this notion of we only have so much money, we got to get it to those who need it the most. That's largely coming from progressive people.
David, that brings us to the next question that we have in what terms are resonant in if vulnerable or at risk aren't meeting the mark, and especially as we advocate for healthcare, quality healthcare for all children, how do we make sure that those who we've been describing as more vulnerable or at risk, children with medical complexity, lots of other chronic conditions or health issues, how do we make sure they're top of mind in child health policy?
So there is a, and this is a 10-minute answer that I'm not going to do 10 minutes on. So there is a school of thought that's called targeted universalism that's been led by a guy named John Powell, who's a lawyer at the law school at Berkeley, not far from where I am right now. And what he suggests is that we start to think about programs that are targeted towards these vulnerable or at-risk populations, and recognize that, we need to serve those populations in ways that are different, but start from a different place. So in the US, we have, if you're a middle-class family, you send your kid to school with lunch money or a box lunch or whatever. But if you're poor, you can get a lunch at school and it's terrible. So, and that's because school lunch in school is targeted towards the very poor. And what John would say is you need to start out with a universal goal, which is a kid should get lunch in school, and talk about the need for this universal program. So that, stop talking so much about kids with special healthcare needs. And I spent, when I was at the Lucille Packard Foundation, our work was largely in building systems of care for kids with special healthcare needs, which is a little easier, quite frankly, because the public doesn't see those kids as being in that situation because of it being their fault. They hold families harmless to that. But to talk about these issues in a much more universal way. So start out with the need, with needs that everybody can relate to. So if you're worried about special education, start out with the need of a quality education for all. And then eventually you get to the point where you realize that there are some people for whom special education is, education meeting that goal requires more resources. So not starting out with that population, but starting out with populations writ large. As far as the role of government and how we talk about that, that's proven, and part of the reason our research is taking longer, and that this is such a tough nut to crack, is that the first several batches of framing that we use to try to talk about government and get people off of this notion that government shouldn't be in their lives all failed. And in fact, they all had kind of a negative impact on the way people thought about these issues. So we talked about government as partner, we talked about government as us, and mostly because of kind of intentional work done by people who want to diminish the role of government in the United States. This has proven very challenging. But we do have some messaging right now that seems to maybe be getting people a little bit closer to understanding the potentially helpful role of not so much government, but systems outside of the family. And people have a pretty easy time understanding that when families need help, they go to their friends and family members and neighbors. And then that's not much of a leap to go to their local government from friends and neighbors. And once you get there, there's not much of a leap to get to, state and regional governments. People don't see, part of the effort to improve the salience of these issues is they're going to have to see it in their own lives and in the lives of the kids that they love. And as long as we're only talking about the needs of those other kids, it's hard for people to get there. So those are the things that we're exploring right now.
Thank you. We are going to watch with interest the results of your work. As I said to you, David, before we began, I've been following your work since the late, I guess, 20 teens, and frameworks for even longer. And there's a lot that we can learn, but I think we need to understand it in the Canadian context as well.
Right. Yeah.
How do you measure your success? How do you know your efforts are working, and what do you do from an evaluation point of view?
Yeah, so in the short run, the outcome measures for this work, we have some baseline measures on these core questions of salience of kids issues and collective responsibility and efficacy. And what we're looking for right now is, do we have a set of frames that can be used to actually, move those metrics? Can we improve people's sense of collective responsibility and efficacy with the messaging? Whether those messages actually translate to improvement in the status of child well-being is a longer term question that we, quite frankly, have not answered yet. Messaging is a part of the solution to that. But we firmly believe that until we start to move these deep cultural mindsets, we're not going to make a lot of progress on all of the child well-being outcomes that keep the US mired in the middle of the bottom quartile of the pack of the developed countries in the world.
And sadly, we're right there with you.
Yeah, a little better in most regards, but not in a position anybody's going to be proud of. And from what in the conversations I've had with Canadians, most Canadians don't necessarily believe or understand that that's the case.
No, in fact, yeah.
And I suspect, much as it is here, telling people about that may not be as helpful as you think it might be.
Right. Thank you so much, David, for this really great presentation. I do hope to bring you back at another time to understand the results of your work and to follow it over time. It's the end of our time together today. So thanks for sharing your time and expertise with us, David. And thank you to all the audience members for joining in. We hope you bring back something to your organization from today's messaging, and perhaps even thinking differently about the language we're using.
And thank you, Paul. I hope you'll have a chance to share those 3 papers with the people who are attending today. And if anybody has any questions on reading these things, I laugh. Brainworks calls these issue briefs. They're not brief.
They're not brief.
They're not brief. But if you have any questions, just feel free to reach out to me.
I did share them in the chat box with the link to those papers. Great. So folks check there. Upcoming on our Spark Conversations podcast series, Child Health in the Media, a snapshot of the media representation of child health, which we'll launch on March 27th. This episode will involve season 3 podcast host Catherine Smart in conversation with reporter Carly Weeks. As well, in March, we are excited to bring you another webinar, Media and Child Health, Bridging the Gap in the Delivery of Child Health Information. And next month, April, our Spark theme is Child Health Policy, where we're going to be bringing you another set of Spark Live webinars and a podcast. Stay tuned for more details. It's always great if you can watch live, as your questions and comments really enrich the discussion. But if you can't, the recordings of these sessions are made available after the fact on our website. Check out childhealthcan.ca. And again, thanks for joining us today. Thanks to David for this presentation. And hopefully we'll see many of you back here for another Spark Live session. Bye, everyone.